So, hello everybody. Today I'm sitting down with George Weld. Hi, George.
Hi.
Thanks for doing this with me.
Yeah, good to
Just
see
to
you.
start things off, if you could give everybody just a brief introduction of who you are and how you find yourself in the photography world.
Yeah. I am I live in upstate New York in the Hudson Valley. I spent a long time living in the city, grew up in the South, and have just always had a kind of interest in, or a sort of hunger to find a way to make sense of the world that no one practice was really able to fulfill. I mostly have worked as a writer or thought of myself as a writer, but I've always also used a camera and played music and cooked food. And it just has happened that in the past 5, 7 years, photography and writing have really kind of come together in a way that's been both satisfying for me personally and in a way where I felt like I was able to collaborate with some really interesting people and do some interesting projects that felt really rewarding. That's kind of where my focus has been lately. And
Cool. Awesome. And
yeah.
I guess first thing I wanted to start out by asking you is kind of like what drew you to pursuing a master's degree in creative writing, given that
Mm.
your artistic interests are very plural, like you mentioned music, cooking, photography. Do you see writing as kind of like the foundation of your creative practice that other things branch out of?
I think so. I mean, part of it is just it's just the fact that that's the thing I've studied the most and have the most kind of experience with. And I think really any creative practice you really dive deep into will teach you a million lessons about life and making work and how to think and stuff like that. And it just happened that writing is the one that I focused on that initially, and that was due partly to the fact that I grew up in a family that while everybody was also interested in photography and music, they were obsessed with language, and the way to sort of win favor at the dinner table was to use language the best, and the quickest way to be sort of driven driven into exile was to use a word inappropriately or stumble over your sentences, which I still do in spite of all that. But it was like a quick way to like prestige in the little economy of my family. And it also felt like, when I was young anyway, it was kind of before really like bedroom recording was a thing with music. And so if you wanted to be a musician, you kind of had to be where I lived anyway, you had to like dream of yourself as a rock star, and pretty quickly you realized you weren't going to be one, or I wasn't going to be one. And I don't know, it just sort of felt like writing felt like it was something I could do on my own. It was something I could do anywhere. It was relatively respectable, and yeah, I mean, I loved it. I really loved language, and I loved thinking about words and thinking about poems and kind of what they gave back to me. And yeah, so when I had the chance to go do graduate work, I leapt at it. But yeah, it feels like it could have little decisions in your life, or little like
Yeah.
people you meet that if one person had been a little bit more enthusiastic, maybe I would have gone down a different path. But
Yeah, absolutely. No, no, I totally get that.
yeah.
Especially whenever you have multiple interests. Some people have a very narrow focus of what they want to do, and other people, they need to have their foot in every body of
Hmm.
water. I'm the same way. So,
Yeah.
I was a musician before I got into photography, and writing has always just kind of been a background thing that I always did, just like a
Hmm.
need for self-expression. And quite often it was mainly in lyrics and poetry, and then
Hmm.
eventually it started becoming more like a little bit more prose based and stuff. So I definitely understand where you're coming from with that. And I'm kind of curious, like where did your interest in images and text kind of come from, and how did that progress into finding yourself working a lot with photographs, whether that be your own or in collaboration with other artists like Adriana Alt or Raymond Meeks, and so on? Like, how did you find yourself progressing from an interest in text and images to photography, and what was it about photography that kind of really sparked a deeper interest for how these things work together?
Hmm. Um, I mean, again, I should say, like from early on, I was really interested in making images. I mean, I was interested in printmaking, and I mean, like in high school, and then
Mhm.
like the art studio was where the art building was where I felt the most at home at school. And I think I was always also kind of interested in that kind of like teenage way where you're like doodling on your notebook and like writing band names or whatever, and like funny
Yep.
typefaces or whatever. Like made me really interested in like the shape of words and the way that words have a physical visual presence.
Mhm.
So it was, I think it was like kind of always simmering in the back of my mind, and my best friends were always almost always visual artists. Um, and then when I was in grad school, not for my after I did a creative writing degree, I started a PhD, and um, I was kind of at sea in that program, not really sure if I really wanted to be in it. And I took this one class that was taught by a guy who really focused on the materiality of books.
Mhm.
And in that class, we read William Blake. And in the course of reading that, it was like I think we've talked about this before, but like the first time I ever realized that Blake was not just a visual artist as well, but that his whole idea or his whole kind of practice was about setting his own poetry in this like visual context. And I was so appalled that we hadn't grown up studying them in that setting, like that we were always looking at his poems extracted from their visual setting as though they were just written like anyone else's poems, and as though the entire value of those poems was in the words themselves, as opposed to the whole world that he kind of built around them. Um, and I think that's really when I started thinking it kind of obsessively about the way image and text related to one another, and the way, I couldn't understand why it bothered me that we didn't talk about that more, or that we didn't study his poems in their visual setting. But I was like, something is missing, and and then of course, like when you start thinking about that, it's our whole world is this sort of saturated landscape of text and image, words treated like images, deciphered for sort of narrative meaning and stuff like that, and yet it felt really underexplored as a mode of art, maybe like they still felt like they were kind of segregated. um and yeah, so I have this like kind of churning interest in that stuff, and then it just happened like I met Adriana really accidentally, and really improbably in a tiny town in upstate New York 15-20 years ago. And then I met Ray through her, and just talking to them and thinking about work with them, and working on pictures with them. Um, I think Ray and actually initially was the one who said, like, why don't you, would you collaborate? Would you write something for this project I'm working on? I was like, so it was really just the generosity of somebody else asking me if I was up for doing something, and then throwing myself into it, and having this whole kind of like overbearing desire to solve a problem, like kind of on my shoulders,
Oh,
getting the opportunity to do it. Yeah.
that makes a lot of sense. Like, especially, I think, like even when I spoke with Brad Zeller, he kind of had maybe a similar kind of trajectory where he was,
Mm.
working for the local. He was working for a newspaper. He was working for some magazines, but then it was a completely impromptu kind of interaction with Alex Soth that kind of like started spearheading him down more this exploratory path of text and images in a more artistic way rather than a caption way, or a photojournalist way of having like a what's the old word for it, like like when you had Time magazine, it was like a photo
Oh yeah, yeah, yeah,
story. I forget the technical term they used back then
yeah.
for that, but yeah, so it's interesting that it seems like people who were in the writing world who maybe had an interest in images, it's kind of like an invitation into another world that they kind of accepted, that kind of like got them going down that path. And I guess kind of like jumping off of that is like I'm kind of curious because like this is something that I find very fascinating too, and I'm just wondering, from you as for a subjective view, when do you feel text and image pairings kind of work best? When I find that when the combination of the two is where they're not necessarily speaking to each other, but the two elements become an idiosyncratic force that makes them a complete thing. I find that's when they're maybe the most powerful. And I've always thought that perhaps that's why poetry and nonlinear prose seem to be a common choice for people when they're pairing text and images, because those types of writing also share the fragmented and ambiguous nature that photographs have. And I was just wondering if you have some ideas about that as well.
Yeah, I mean, I totally agree with you about the when it works most, when it's the most interesting. I mean, there are, so yeah, fundamentally, like my personal interest in it is, and this is one of the things that was so great about working with Ray and Addie, and like I've talked a little bit about it with Brad, and too, like this sort of common experience. Well, the one thing I just want to say that I talked about with Brad is just like as writers, we both like, yeah, um it's one thing to be a writer, but like it's just so much more fun to hang out with photographers. And like part of the like joy of working with photographers, there's this kind of formal interest of it, but it's also just like they just tend to be more interesting and humane feeling than a lot of other artists, a lot of writers. Anyway, yeah, I mean, you already articulated it really well. I think the things that are interesting about when text and image work well together is like it just sort of can kind of amplify the sort of latent mystery in one another, or they can sort of amplify the mystery in one another. Like I think one of the things, just to flip the question, like one of the things I really dislike in the relationship is, anything that tries to explain, or you know, you always have these like impulses early on when photographers were trying to, I mean, writers were trying to justify photography, like saying it's worth paying attention to, it's worth thinking of this as an art. I don't think that needs to be done anymore, but still people write essays sort of it saying like,
Yes.
here's what this photographer is doing. Like you have this book in front of you, but I'm going to tell you how it strikes me, or, and I just find that really tedious, and not necessarily reductive, because you still like, I don't think, I mean, sometimes it just doesn't add anything at all. I mean, I think a lot about, I think we'll probably talk about this later, but like, when I started working in the restaurant world, one of the things that people were still garnishing every plate with, curly parsley and slices of orange, like things nobody would eat. It was just like this sort of, like everyone felt the obligation to put something on the plate to dress it up.
Mhm.
And it's like, I started working in kitchens at a time when people were just like, get rid of all that stuff. We don't want it. Like it's insulting and gross. And that's kind of how I feel about like the state of writing and photography now, is like, we don't need those explanatory essays. That said, there are a lot of, I've been trying to be a little bit more, I mean, there are lots of books that combine like nonfiction, long form prose and photography in ways that I find are kind of interesting, or they're just different from the kinds of things that I've tended to do.
Yeah.
um you know I did a lot of work in as an undergrad on Wallace Stevens, and the whole life of the whole career of Wallace Stevens Poetic Project was this effort to, among other things, was to sort of like describe or give shape to this ineffable center of consciousness, or experience, like something that very much resembles like a spiritual center, or kind of, and the space that God used to contain, occupy, is how we would have thought of it, at least initially. And I'm also interested in that kind of like work, like how, like these like big questions. But that's my personal interest in making work. But I find like the a lot of interest and value in like projects that are much more politically oriented, or engage with social questions, or but in every case I think the key is like both the writing and photography needs to give the respect to the reader of like, you came to this, I'm going to trust you to have your own experience. I'm not going to try to tell you what to do or what to think
Yeah.
about it. I'm not going to be didactic. I'm giving you all this, inviting you to experience it on your own terms, and
Yes.
trying to give you as much interesting sort of fodder for that experience as I can do, without being pedantic or overly prescriptive. Yeah,
Yeah, no, I agree with that. It's like I think there's definitely, of course, value in, political photography. I mean, it's kind of, it's part of its history, and I think there's still value to it. But I think at the same time, when things become captioned or essayed, they can be forgotten very easily as well. especially
Hmm.
in, maybe more, within the last decade where we've kind of lost a little bit of that sensibility to even read captions or even read news articles, read the title, not the article,
Hmm.
read the picture, not the caption. And one project that I can think of that is definitely a political book, but gives so much room to the reader to come up with their own thoughts. And I think the way it's presented has the ability to stay with you a lot longer rather than just explicitly telling you what it's about. That was Christine Potter's
Hmm.
Dark Waters, how she used basically American standards, American standard songs that had explicit violence towards women in their photographs at locations that had violent names. And then with a short story in the back by Rebecca
Bingo.
Bengal, thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think that book, that book really struck me because I was just like that stayed with me. I was like, whoa, like because then you start registering like even songs that you hear today or songs you've heard in the last 30 years that you might have, just sang about or just sang blindly to on the radio, and then you start analyzing them because you've had this
Hmm.
experience with something where it forced you to interact with the lyrics in a different way other than just a sing song and everybody gathers around. I mean, like I think one song that always like stays in my mind. It's not exactly about any kind of violence, but it's about drug abuse, and that's a Semi-Charmed Life by Third Eye Blind.
Oh yeah.
I remember being a kid and just being like, "This is the catchiest song in the world," and you realize it's a song about heroin.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
So it's like one of those things where, as you grow older, if you're put in a position to challenge something that is out of its context, it becomes much more of a powerful tool.
Hmm.
And I guess kind of like branching off that, I was just wondering, like, what are some of your personal favorite image textbooks, and what are some books that you would consider canon for image and text? And could you explain a little bit why you think, especially books that are canon, why you think they deserve that kind of title?
Yeah, I mean, I have to say that my photo book education has been so um sort of idiosyncratic and self-driven that I'm not sure I'm like the guy to talk about canon. I'm happy I can definitely talk about books that I found really effective and moving.
Mhm.
I mean, I think, like one book that I liked early on that I think probably would be in most people's lists of like kind of canonical photo textbooks is the Larry Sultan book about his family.
Yeah.
I don't go back to it a whole lot, but I remember being like, this is a really interesting project. Like it's really like it feels like a really robust memoir,
Mhm.
like really interesting. And, a more recent book that I like that's sort of in the same has the same effect in a very different mode is Andrea Parlato's Who Was Changed and Who Was Dead, I think is the name.
Okay.
Um, a book where like haunting but very plainly told story about family and yeah, I find that book like that's a book I do come back to fairly often. Um, I think obviously I have a debt to Wright Morris. I mean, I think he was a really good example of somebody who was. I mean, one of the things I love the most about Wright Morris is that he was writing and making photographs himself. Like to me, that remains my like when the day I can do that is the day I'll be like, ah, okay, great. Maybe I can move
Yeah.
on to something else. But like it's just so hard. And I think that, I didn't appreciate how hard it was like until more or less recently. And I've been like, oh. So I mean, I really like a lot of Teju Cole's books. I really loved especially Blind Spot.
Same.
Yeah. I just reread Federico Clavarino's Ghost Stories yesterday, and found that really moving and interesting. And then just to like sort of branch out from photo book centric books
Mhm.
that combine image and text, I really, really love this novel, Lost Children Archive by Valeria Luiselli, who's a Mexican American writer or Mexican writer. And it doesn't have a ton of photographs in it, but the whole premise of the book is there are these two archivists and researchers who are like going on this trip from New York to the border, and they're studying the husband is like a sound artist who's like trying to capture the sounds of absence and the sounds of like the border, and she's a more kind of conventional archivist, and so they have boxes of archives in their car. They have their kids, and it's just like this very like slowly unfolding story about migration and the nature of an archive. And the book itself is a kind of palimpsest of all these other like you just find all these references to other books as you read it. Like you'll hear phrases from a lot of phrases from The Wasteland, which is one of my favorite, like a really crucial piece of work for me. Yeah, and it sort of ends with a series of Polaroids. It's just such a kind of like that, almost like feeling of like fading out of a movie where you're like, um, this sort of slow decline, or like the slow
Mhm.
exit from. It's such a nice resolution compared to like a novel's resolution to me. Like it's really like a beautiful way to finish a narrative is to be like, and now I'm just going to give you images.
Yeah.
There's a book of poems I really like called by Robin Costa Lewis. I'm looking over at my bookshelf. um, called "To the Realization of Perfect Helplessness."
Okay.
Um, that also uses archive, like family archive, and then like the sort of story of the first, I think he was African American, but anyway, Black polar explorer and sort of his experience. And again, it's like just sort of trying to explore all these different feelings, but using these sort of archival materials not to sort of tell the story of the archive itself, but
Yeah.
to tell a story that the archive can produce and generate. Um, so yeah, those are. I'm trying to think if there are other ones I really wanted to mention. There's a lot I like, and it's just the fact that like some days for me it's always like what's making me excited right now, and
Yeah.
sometimes those books I'll look at and like 3 weeks later like, oh,
Yeah.
that's such a bummer.
Yeah.
What was I excited about here? But like those books are ones that I like find really compelling over and over again for sure.
No, no, I get that because there's some books where I have that experience where the first time it's like whoa, and then I don't understand what initially had that big bang for me.
Yeah,
I think that's just being human. Just depending
yeah,
on when something finds you.
yep,
Like there are some songs that I'm just like like out of nowhere, just like I need to hear that one particular song that I never want to hear it again. It's just one of those things about being human and just how things can kind of strike you. Um, so like another thing that I'm kind of like interested in too, is because I know you kind of like make your own handmade maquettes and stuff like that at home, and I know you also have the opportunity to sometimes be staff for the Penumbra photobook program. I don't know if you're always faculty for that program, but I know you do work with it sometimes. So I'm just kind of curious, like how much, in your opinion, does design and the physical object, like in our case, what we're talking about books, affect the experience of the relationship between text and images, like in the sense of, fragmenting text and interspersing it throughout the image sequence, like image sequence with short poems, placing strategic places, deliberate obfuscation of text by maybe having translucent paper or kind of like I loved Christian Patterson's term for it in Gonko, marginalia in the margins, where he would have
hmm
that kind of like very faint hidden writing. I'm just curious, like how much do you feel like the actual physical design of a book can actually affect the way text also interacts with it?
yeah. I mean, it's such an interesting question because like text in itself is like this extremely portable or like technology, right? Like, um, and when you're reading text, no matter what setting it's in, I find like I'm almost always like it's just me and what I'm reading, like, and
Mm.
everything else around it is like blocked out. Whether I'm reading somebody's handwriting or I'm reading it like on a broadsheet or in the middle of a novel, like it's like this weird kind of like magical space between you and the page where you're just it's like a performance that you're conducting and like I don't know, it's like this amazing experience.
Mm.
But like obviously you come to that um with this like with expectations that the book itself creates for you. And so like I do think there's like a core of the reading experience that's almost like can survive any kind of abuse or kind of any or that persists in any kind of setting.
Mm.
But there is still this kind of like the context that you put it in just it's almost like music in a film like kind of tells you where to look or how to think about it as you go into it um and I mean the other thing that I think is and maybe we'll talk about this a little bit more too, but like one of the things I love about the relationship of physical objects to the reading experience is like or one of the reasons I love a book in particular is a photo book, especially, is that, you know, we have the idea that they're supposed to be linear. And, you know, we always talk about sequence and blah, 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 but like really they reward so many different modes of reading, you know, like
Mhm.
it's like a collection of poems can do this too, where you like, yes, you can read it straight through, but it's also cool to like open it in the middle and start there and then go both directions and then, or, you know, flip back and forth a few times in a certain section. You know, you can kind of just explore it in your own way. So in that sense, I think the more the physical object of the book expects that behavior by a reader and rewards that kind of behavior from a reader, the more the more interesting it can be. You know, I mean, I love a simple book, but I also really love a book where you're like, yeah, like lifting up a page and there's a little surprise, or you know, or as you say, like the text is obscured and then revealed, and you have this kind of just it's like a whole category of image and textbook that we didn't talk about at the beginning that or earlier on. Like, I mean, there's like a series of guidebooks by this graphic designer named Richard Saul Werman put together,
Okay.
and they would do them for all these different cities. They're out of print now. They were called Access or something like that, and they were just like this. Every page was like there's text that's like very like specific and interesting about some little feature of this city, and there'd be like a little drawing, and then but like it was almost like the experience of looking at a Richard Scarry children's book, you know, where you're
Okay.
like
Yep.
you keep looking around and it keeps being interesting, and no matter what level of attention you give it, like whether you're kind of looking at the page as like just a you know zoomed out, or if you're reading what the page has for you, it keeps rewarding all these different levels of engagement.
Yeah.
And that's what I love seeing that kind of thing in a photo book or a book of any kind, where you're like, yeah, it's cool just to blast through this, but it's also cool to go backwards, or it's cool to like notice this motif repeating itself as you go through, or this little section I just really love in particular, and the rest of it I can kind of let go of. You know,
Yeah.
I don't know if I really answered, and I feel like I just wandered around quite a bit in there, but
No, no, no. I mean, like there's so many possibilities. I think that's what I love about books is that there's a myriad of possibilities, but there's also an inherent built-in limitation to it as
Mhm.
well. That you can't do certain things with a book that you can do with an exhibition. But
Yeah,
I like that limitation, but I like that you can also push that limitation in a lot of different directions, and it can be so simple or it could be insanely complex depending on how you want to present it. Like I think like a really simple one that I encountered recently. I hope I'm going to say his last name right. Dylan Hostler.
yeah.
He had a book, What the Rain Might Bring. I should be saying they actually. They had a book, What the Rain Might Bring, and uh, the text is actually hidden underneath the end paper at the back of the book. And if you
Oh
want to
wow.
read it, you actually have to cut it out of the book. So you
Oh
actually
wow.
have to deface your book if you
Yeah,
want to
yeah,
get to
yeah.
the text. I love that kind of stuff. Like for me, like that's like, oh, this is
Yeah,
fun.
yeah,
This
yeah.
is exciting. And it was done in such a good way that the first time I looked through the book, I didn't even notice that there was a bubble in the back. It wasn't until like the second time I was like, oh, like there's something hidden here.
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
This
yeah.
is cool. And like it was kind of like a little short story that really didn't explain anything that was happening in the book. It just made the mystery that much greater, and it was just so much more rewarding because you had to tear out that piece of the back end paper of the book to get to it. So I guess that kind of like brings me around to like another question that I wanted to ask you, and like what are some methods you've employed when creating text for photo books, like with Adriana or Ray? Those are two very different ways that you went about creating text. And are there any kind of like insights you could provide for people whenever they're working on text and images? Just some maybe like some organizing principles that you found helpful whenever working on projects.
Yeah. I mean, and you've heard me say this before, but like my main method is just to write and write and write and write and write. Like I like to put the pictures that I'm working around like in front of me or keep them around me as much as possible. Look at them a bunch, just like let them soak in.
Mhm.
You know, like for me, what I'm trying to do is not to write about the pictures, but like think about what the sort of total experience of looking at these pictures is for me, and what kind of feelings are they stimulating? What maybe there's some like I see some motifs or like some repetitions in them, like that I can isolate and sort of riff off of, and then it becomes this like very much like a improvisatory thing where like, okay, that's kind of an interesting word. Like that made me think about this word, and I'll start playing with that word, and you know, just a lot of kind of unstructured writing without a sense of where it's going or what it's gonna, how it's gonna end up interacting with the pictures in the end. I think there was one time I worked on a project that was like a collection of photographers, like I think 11, 10 photographers' portfolios, and each one had 10 pictures in it. And I was going to write a series of 10 stories, something like that, that was like the equivalent. And there too, I just sort of like went through everybody's work and was like, what's like exciting me essentially? Like what am I going to feel like I can spend time like thinking about or um and it can be pretty abstract things like fear, or it can be really concrete things like it seems like there's water keeps coming up in this, so like let me think about water, and then it's just so much about making associations. I mean, like the entire process of making a photo book anyway, it's just about like these kind of like hard to explain associations you're working out. And it's interesting because like you don't have to articulate those associations when you're sequencing pictures or you're putting pictures together. You can just do it and you're like, oh no, that's the one.
Yeah.
And I try to have a similar relationship to the writing, even though in that case, like you're articulating everything. It's all about articulateness. But it still is a kind of situation where I'm like, this text feels like it will go well with this series of pictures somehow. Like
Yeah.
it gives a similar feeling, or like with Adriana, is like there was it helped having some common backstory. Like we both grew up in places that were threatened by and destroyed by hurricanes, and had the feeling of like, you grew up in the southeast on the coast, like you spend a lot of time waiting around for storms, like they're coming, there's nothing you can do about it, you're just like buckling down and waiting for it. And that book was about sort of the experience of grief and loss, and this sort of watching how a death affects a family and affects a person's consciousness. And I was like, and it's set in New Orleans, and or largely set in New Orleans. Like just felt like, all right, these feelings all kind of like work together. It's like
Yeah.
this sense of anticipation and dread, and the difficulty of trying to work with this hanging over your head and keeping how those feelings impinge on your imagination. And then it's like a question of you generate a ton of material, and we've talked about this, but like you generate all this written material, and then I just treat it like a photograph. Like, well, I'll find chunks that feel interesting, and it was really helpful to work with. Both everyone I've worked with has been really collaborative. So I'll same way you would with like, what do you think about these pictures? What comes out, what stays in. You just play that game, but with with paragraphs of writing or sentences or chunks of poetry or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes that leads to more work. Like you're like, oh, I want to develop this more, or this.
Yeah.
I woke up in the middle of the night thinking about this, and it feels attached to that.
Mm-hmm.
And then it just, I don't know, it just becomes this sort of like, it's very much like the experience of putting together a sequence of photographs, only you're also including text. And I think the key is just to avoid being too analytical about it, where you're like not trying to be literal, not trying to be like, I mean, there were times, especially working with Ray on The Inhabitants, where we would have to be like, well, these can't be too close together because this text suddenly looks like it's explaining that picture or talking too directly about that picture. And we don't want to reduce that. So we would like pull them apart a little bit.
One of the things that, just to give context for everybody listening, I took a workshop with you with text and image. So I got a little bit of, background insight. And so like, just to give everybody a bit of perspective who's listening, with Adriana Alt's book, the text was on the back of the book itself. So it wasn't even, a part of the photo sequence. It's this thing when you turn the book over, there's the text, and with the inhabitants with Raven Meeks, the text is fragmented, interspersed throughout the book. And one of the things that I found particularly interesting is when you showed us how you were kind of working with those images in the fragmented sense of the text was you had, like little cue cards or, little pieces of paper, and you were doing this as one would do with photographs, playing with them like, like a whiteboard like I have over there.
Yeah.
Moving photo. You were also moving text around in the same way you would move photographs around. And I think that's something that can be really helpful for people who are trying to work with text in that way, because whenever you're doing it on the computer, it's really easy for that to become cemented really quickly, because you don't have that ability to have a bigger picture of things moving around. You kind of can if you zoom out a little bit, but it doesn't have the same feeling. So it's like you write this piece of text and it's on this page of the PDF. It feels a lot more stuck there than it does if you're just writing it on a piece of paper, putting it up on a bulletin board, and then able to shuffle it around. So I thought that was like a really insightful kind of like thing that I think people could really take away that I thought was really, really cool. And kind of like going into more, your own photography, you have a project called Landsman's Kill that I think is really, really wonderful and lovely.
Oh, thank you.
And I found it interesting because, in the description of the photo book maquette, there is mention of a novel, but there is no text in the actual photo book maquette. And I think it was kind of like interesting to also think about, when does a photo project call for text and when it doesn't, because I think, I think it was Tim Carpenter who said this to me, is that, like he believes photographs are enough on their own, and that, if the text is there, you have to have a really good argument for that text to be there. But if your argument is sound and solid, then it belongs. But you have to have a sound kind of like argument for it in the realm of photography. Of course, that's subjective, of course, but I think it is something interesting to think about of when does one feel like text is actually going to bring that little bit of extra something to a photo book, or is it just going to be more weight that's not needed, in the raft, so to speak. So I'm just kind of curious how you think about that, since you also have made, a few maquettes yourself, and I've noticed the maquettes you've made don't really include text aside from a title, which I mean, of course, is text itself, but
Sure.
But not really like long form text, of course.
Yeah. That's funny. Like, I mean, thanks for looking at that stuff. I mean, Landsman Kill in particular, I really wanted to test myself. Like, for me, it's writing, relatively speaking, comes easy. I feel much less secure as a photographer, and I really wanted to see if I could make a book that felt like it moved and was complete and satisfied me without leaning on text.
Mm-hmm.
So it was almost like an exercise. And I was never like, my feeling was like, I'm not saying I'm not going to put text in a version of this down the road, but I just want to try to do it without it. I did some writing for Cyprian Honey Cathedral, Ray's book with Addie a couple of years ago. And the first time I saw that, I was like, this book doesn't need me. Need any text in it? And Ray's like, nope, it's going to have it and you're going to write it. Like, he just sort of insisted on it.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't question that impulse in him, but like, I think Tim is right, but I don't know that for me, I can know in advance whether the text is necessary or not, for me, I was writing alongside that Landsman Kill work the entire time I was making it, but I was like, I always had it in mind.
Mm-hmm.
But I don't even know if I'll know if that book can sustain text until I've like sat down and started like putting it together with it. It's kind of like what we were saying at the beginning, like there's something here I'm trying to understand or describe or connect with. And I have these various tools to do that. What's going to get me closest? Will photos alone do it? And really the answer to that question is different from the question of like the answer to like what makes a photo book satisfying to a stranger, so it's tricky. For me, I just I have to try these things out and see what works. I mean, like, the little maquettes I've done a group of them without text and a group with text, and when I do it, it's really the same thing. Like, what happens if this picture is followed by this line?
Mhm.
Oh, that's kind of cool. Like, it's just, I don't know. And in that case, like my goal was not to make my goal was to make a photo text combination. Like,
Yeah.
so it wasn't a question of like this needs to I need to prove that it needs text. It was like the whole point is that these two things I want these two things to work together. I don't disagree with Tim about what he's saying at all. I just think there, the way when he says that, it's very much from the point of view of like a photographer's perspective,
Yep.
like a photo first perspective, which maybe if I were a better photographer, I would also feel that way. But like for me, that I need more. I have to like support myself on a couple different feet, so to speak.
No, I get
Weird
that.
metaphor, but
And also, Tim, if you're listening, I'm not trying to pigeonhole you here, Tim. I know that you believe in text and images as well.
yeah, if
But
anybody does.
I think it just really comes down to, I think a lot of people actually just genuinely struggle with, and that is just trying things. I think that's just something that is kind of generally hard for people, especially,
Mhm.
I think especially, that really depends. I mean, I think really with any medium for that matter, I think it comes down to, like, especially if you've been working on a photo project for 5 years or something like that, and you've had 5 years to make this thing up in your mind to be this thing, when in reality it might be something completely different
Yeah,
by the time you're done it. But you've built up this kind of like preconceived notion that this was the thing that I started out to do. So I think it's something that people just really need to like kind of like learn to like break down, myself included. I know I struggle with that. And I have a music project with a friend of mine, Phil, here in Montreal. And one of the things I love working about with Phil, it's a miracle that we get anything done because we both have ADHD. But is that I'm someone, if I come up with like a musical idea, I'll be kind of like married to it pretty quickly. And Phil is the kind of guy that he's a drummer and I'm a guitarist, and like we'll get into the jam space, and then he'll be like, well, play the rhythm this way and then play the rhythm that way. And what if we played that part of the riff longer than that part of the riff? And what if we shortened that part of the riff? And he'll force me to dissect it like 50 different ways to
totally.
either arrive at that my conviction was right at the beginning of the musical idea was this, or by the end of it was like, no, you're right. We have something completely better that's going on here. And I think it's the same thing with any kind of project. But I guess especially with photography, it's like doesn't hurt to write some text, see if it works, see if it fits
Yeah.
in or not. You're not going to know unless you actually give it the chance to have that encounter, because if you don't, then you're just not going to know at all.
Yeah,
And
totally.
I think it's interesting because it's something else that I kind of wanted to talk to you about. 'Cause I know you have an interest in this as well. And I think photographers in general have had an interest in this too, going back to Stieglitz all the way up to, Ron Jude, and maybe more recently Matthew Tempo with Dog Breath.
Mm-hmm.
And Ron Jude, I'm referring to his book, Lagos, I think.
Lago. Yeah.
Lago. Where, Alfred Stieglitz, his idea of equivalent, where, he had composer write, classical music to these photographs of clouds, with the idea of, like there being equivalent there to, like Lago with Ron Jude with field recordings. And I think it might even be the same person who did the field recordings for Ron Jude, who did them for Matthew Tempo.
Different person.
Different person? Okay, thank you for correcting me. But, I think that's like an interesting thing because, text and image is something that is easier to put into contact with each other in the book form because, they can be married together in a solid way. Whereas something like, creating a field recording or a piece of music for a photo book, that becomes much more abstract in the sense that you could put the time and effort into it, but will that encounter actually happen? Is someone going to go onto SoundCloud and listen to the field recording or Lago while actually flipping through the book? In the exhibition, it can be forced a little bit more because you can have the music playing in the space. So as you're going through the space and interacting with the images, the sound is there as well. So I'm kind of curious, like what do you think about these other ways of incorporating kind of like sound and music with photographs? I just find it fascinating because
Yeah.
it's not like cinema where it's like it's married together unless you're doing like a slideshow or something like that and you like put a piece of music with a slideshow. You know, like we all have a graduation tape somewhere where
Yeah.
there's a
Yeah.
some corny song playing.
Semi-charmed kind of life thing.
Exactly,
Yeah, exactly.
exactly. So I find that interesting because like that's something I've been wanting to play with myself is making field recordings, but also I had the idea of making, I mean, this is probably going to sound silly to say it out loud, but like video photographs where it's just a static still shot that doesn't move. And just to have like the field recording of like 10 minutes, you just spend 10 minutes looking at this moving scene, but it's just one static thing.
Yeah.
So I just find that area so fascinating because, like I remember, my experience when I picked up Lago by Ron Jude and sitting down with my headphones on and being immersed in that and going through it was like, wow, what a wonderful way to experience a book. I was like, this is so cool. So I'm kind of just like curious about your thoughts on that a little bit.
I mean, I love it. Like the Lago was a real like life-changing book for me. And I feel like he actually says like it's not meant to like be a soundtrack to the book, you don't, but like it's you have to try it once you've got them both. Like, and it's so rewarding either way. Like I love listening. I mean, first of all, I loved it because I wasn't really like that aware of sound art of that type, at least as a freestanding thing, until then. And so I went down, like the artist who worked on that was Joshua Bonetta, and I went down a deep rabbit hole of his work. He's also done projects that involve his own photographs, and yeah, I mean it's so interesting because it, for one thing, it just raises all these questions about time. Like when you listen to field recordings, it feels like you're out of time, like they're not like progressing in the way that like a narrative does. So you feel immersed in it, and yet it is unfolding over time. I heard somebody talking about I don't know if you know the sort of electronic composer named Eliane Radig, talking about her music the other day. It was like you never feel it moving, but you suddenly realize you've gone this massive distance over the course of like 15, 20 minutes, which can be very similar to me, the feeling of like looking through photographs where you like restore some magic to them or something like that in some way. Like I can't even explain it. I really, really love it. I just went back through Dog Breath a minute ago before we talked, with that music, that sound piece playing by I think Michael Muller. It just feels like so generous. Like you're really like bathing in this world all of a sudden. Yeah, I wish there were a way to make it like a non-corny way to make music just start playing when you open the book or whatever. Like there are films that have like I think Sans Soleil, the Chris Marker film, like
Yeah.
for me feels close to that kind of experience,
Yeah.
or like Stalker, the Tarkovsky film, like
Yes.
uses sound in a way that feels very much like that. But I really like honestly, I think I'd rather listen to music and look through a photo book than watch a movie. Like, I just get so like agitated and like restless when I'm trying to sit through a film. Whereas with a photo book, I'm being active and like changing pages and like looking at different things and listening to this stuff. And it just feels like I'm participating in this creation as opposed to like watching a film where I tend to be more of a passive, and I get a little kind of antsy, I think. And I think like field recording in particular is interesting because it is very much like the process of making pictures where you're taking a weird machine out into the world. If you want to get closer to that sound, you have to move your body to where like this is the
Yes.
kind of thing that Tim talks about all the time. Like if you
Yes.
want, or your body itself can become part of the transmission. The sound of you walking, the sound of your breath, the sound of something muffled by your body.
Yes.
um I love the way these machines are kind of like augment our capabilities, and can like also make us pay attention to things and explore the world and recreate the world and reconstitute the world. Like it happens for me in field recording and photography in a very different way than it happens with language, even though I feel like language can play really well with both of those things. Field recording and photography just feel like like they're part of a continuum. I just admit that it just makes me so excited to think
No,
about it. I
no,
don't
no,
really have
no.
any more to say than that, but
No, no, I completely agree with you because I was going to go that road if you weren't going to bring it up. It's exactly what kind of Tim talks about. It's like like I fantasize a lot because I can't afford a copy of The Pond by John Gossage, you know. And so I've fantasized about that book in so many different ways. You know, I've made my own tributes to The
Uh,
Pond. You know, I've made my own, I think I've made two photographic projects so far that are like tributes to The Pond, and then I've thought about like I want to make a field recording of The Pond. You know,
mhm.
this abstract thing that I can't obtain because of financial reasons. I've built so much up in my head, and I just want to have like all these like like idiosyncratic experiences with it without actually interacting with the thing itself. And like I can just think of just like, oh, what a treat, like to like look at the pond with like like a field recording would be. I think it would be
Yeah,
such a cool thing, because I think especially with photographers who kind of use cameras in that kind of bodily inquisitive way. Field recordings, like you said, the machine interacts the same way. Depending on how close you are to a leaf, it's going to change the sound of the wind blowing through the trees and affecting that leaf. It's a completely different thing. Just how like sunlight filtering through leaves is going to change depending on how close you are standing. It's audio is going to change the same way, which I think is really interesting. And
totally.
just kind of to close things off, I know like for people who might not know you, but they'll be able to read on your website. Like you grew up kind of like in the church, and that was kind of like a profound experience for you in the sense that you realize there's all these different interactions of different mediums happening in one place, between language, where it's you could just have the general announcements of what's going on in the community that week, to hymns being spoken, to incantations, prayers, music, the architecture, the lights streaming through the windows,
Yeah.
the way sound resonates in those places. And I know you also have quite a bit of experience of working in kitchens, and I think you've contributed to cookbooks or have written cookbooks yourself. And I was kind of curious. This maybe is a little bit an off-topic question, but I just was curious to think, like, do you think the kitchen is maybe one of the closest places outside of church where you found this melting of all these different things? Because I can think of like when I was in bands myself, like a lot of people either did jobs like myself, worked manual labor in a warehouse, or they
Mhm.
worked in kitchens, and with those friends, we would have, a lot of like, these backyard barbecues and stuff like that. And it was just always this place of, there's always music playing. There was, like stories being told.
Yep.
Recipes themselves are a form of folklore, history, storytelling. Cookbooks are photo books. They
Yeah.
contain imagery and they pair text with it. There's a local writer here in Montreal, Annick Giroux, and I think she's done 2 volumes of the Heavy Metal Cookbook, where she traveled
Uh,
around the world, going to bands' houses and having band members bring a family recipe out for her, teach her that recipe. And so it's like a history of the band and the
wow.
music, but also incorporating like their family's history with food and all that kind of stuff. So I was just kind of curious if maybe the kitchen is like the closest you found to like another place having that kind of like
Yeah.
smorgasbord experience of art mediums.
Yeah. I mean, I would definitely say a restaurant is like,
Okay.
like because and I had been thinking a little bit of like, the restaurant is where the whole kind of like performance, like the church experience happens. Like you're thinking about when you're designing a restaurant or like thinking about what you want it to be, like it's all about like what experience do I want people to have? Like what are we giving people?
Yeah.
And you are kind of hoping to have and again, you're having all these different yeah, like you're giving them a menu, you're talking to them, you're playing music, you have light that's affecting the way they think about things. I mean, I think, I kind of burned out on it a little bit, but like I still believe like restaurants are like can be a really magical place. I mean, feeding people can be a really magical thing. Um, Kitchens are interesting in a different way for me. I mean, cooking and developing recipes and stuff like that, definitely like it's the same kind of like iterative, just try it and see what happens and then tweak it and try it and tweak it. Like that experience that you learn from writing poems or editing pictures or whatever, like it's the same thing. Like actually that's gross in there. Let's take that out and put this in there and see how that tastes like.
Yeah.
And then, oh, that is really good. Um, and so uh as a matter of like experimentation and stuff like that, is really interesting. But the thing that to me, like when I think about kitchens, the thing that like is so interesting to me, especially coming from a writing background, is like they're the most embodied, like where you are the most in your body of anywhere. And it's a weird place because a lot of times you can't, even if you share a language with the person you're working with, you can't always communicate because there's the noise of the hood
Yeah.
vent, the hood fan, all the noise of it, and you have to be quiet for things to stay organized. And you just learn to like move around another person's body. You're in a position, like you're in relation to one another at a, like you're so close together. Like if you were in any other context, you'd be like, "You're freaking me out, man. Like
Yeah.
stand back. Like you're in my space." But there, you're like reaching under each other's arms. You're bumping into one another, but never too much to like spill anything. Like you
Mm,
just learn this sort of like dance, this like musical dance, and language can't capture it. Like you can't write how to behave as a line cook in a book and have someone figure it out.
yeah.
It's a thing you have to learn through your body and through the experience of moving in a kitchen around other people, which takes me back to the thing with a camera, where you're out in the world. Like I think about this thing Tim said all the time of like, if you don't like the way it looks here, you have to move your whole body over here
Yeah.
to get a different view.
Yes.
In just that kind of like that embodiment of working in a context like that is so interesting, and I don't know what to say about it. I guess it's a place where like the limits of language in particular really show themselves in a way that makes it feel okay. Like we don't have to. Not everything has to be captured in language. There's a whole world of like human interaction and behavior and movement and beautiful like choreographed like activity that exists outside of our ability to talk about it, even
Mhm.
to explain it. We had a restaurant in Tokyo and we taught, all the food on the menu. And in Japan, I don't want to like Japan is so overly mythologized by Westerners, but like this is one thing that I think I've checked out with people that seems to be true. Like in Japan, like when you're very young, this may also happen in Waldorf school. Somebody's told me recently, like you're taught how to use your body before you're taught how to use anything else. So like
Mm,
they learn like little coordinated tasks, and then they learn this like set of calisthenics that people do all the way through adulthood. The first time I saw it, the first time I became aware of it, it was because the fire department next to the restaurant, all these grown-ups were out in the parking lot in the middle of the afternoon doing this coordinated calisthenics workout. I'm like, what? It looks so funny. Like, but then when we taught these cooks how to make this food, we would just show them once and they could do it immediately. And it was just like they had honed this sense of like how to use your body and how to respond to somebody else's body and how to like look at an abstraction emotion in somebody else and how to like bring it into yourself
yeah.
in a way that just felt like so beautiful and also like really helpful. It's like,
Yeah.
I can't believe you can do that.
Yeah.
It kind of gave me this hope for like, tuning your hands or your like kind of connecting everything together in a way that we tend to like mess up I mean, in my life, it tends to get messed up anyway. And so that went a little far afield from your initial question, but
No,
like,
no,
yeah.
no, no, no. That's great. No, and I think there's like there's a lot of value in that, just that it makes me think of like I mean like I've done manual labor my entire life, and
Mhm.
like I haven't necessarily been on like too many assembly line type scenarios, but I also worked in the music industry a long time as like as a rigger and stagehand and stuff like that, and I was fortunate for a good while to be able to choose the people I got to work with because I could
Mhm.
bring, like my own team of people and stuff like that. And definitely gravitated towards certain people, not necessarily because of their physical strength, but because of how, their body and their mind worked was similar to mine. So it was just everything went so much faster because there wasn't this need for oral communication of instruction. It was we do it once, we know what we're doing, and we can just kind of like just keep going through these motions, and it just streamlines everything so much. And I think it gives me the set, for being in bands, like the people I've collaborated musically with, it's kind of like the same thing. Like I don't have a very strong foundation in music theory. It's something that I've basically always taught myself by ear. Something I've always
Mhm.
wanted to delve into more. And a lot of the people I've worked with, don't also have a strong sense in musical theory. So like we have a baseline of communication, but the rest of it is kind of a little bit abstract still for a lot of people I've worked with, because we don't have that common knowledge that someone who can sight read music does, who can,
Yeah.
just be like, okay, follow the chart and we go through the motions. It's a lot of just like, do you think in harmony the same way I think in harmony? Because once you find someone who thinks in the same harmony as you do, even if you don't have that language, you know how to communicate it because you both have that same idea of harmony in your head.
Yeah.
And I think that just kind of like ties into the whole idea of collaboration too. Like
Yeah.
if you're a photographer working with a writer, working photographer, or a sound artist working with someone else, it's people who have this similar resonance, that things don't need to be overly explained. And I think that's only to the benefit of the work, is when things don't have to go that extra mile of like having to explain everything, and it can be a little bit more felt. And I think that can be frustrating for people when they're trying to learn things, whenever an artist says it's intuition.
Yeah. Yeah.
But intuition is something that you grow and learn with as well. It's a skill that you have to hone in yourself. You have to learn to be intuitive with your own self and your own bodies and your own decisions and everything like that. So I think it's a good way to kind of summarize everything we've been talking about, because it is this thing, when you're collaborating with others, you need to be in sync in some way.
And most of all, in my opinion, is like you have to pay attention, like, and not cloud your vision or your ears with like some idea that you have about what you're trying to do, but you just like, what's happening here? What am I looking at? What am I hearing? How do I respond to that? And it becomes just like your body is just responding to an actual thing in the world, and not being cluttered by, well, the next chord in this progression should be this,
Yes.
because or this would be better if you had a shallower depth of field or whatever. Like you're just exploring and trusting and paying attention.
No, absolutely, absolutely. Well, thank you, George, so much for
Oh man, thank
time
you.
to talk with me. This has been wonderful. So thank you so much for doing this.
Thanks, buddy.